so if we can have everybody come to the front, back to their seats, please. We're going to try what we can to move along. You'll have a chance, and remind everyone again to please look at the silent auction to your left. You'll have more time to do that as lunch as well. If everyone can please take their seats. If we can have some quiet there to the left. I hate being the teacher, but I guess I'm being the teacher. That's why I didn't have children. They don't match my drapes. Okay, thank you very much. All right, Heidi, I'll let you take it from here. Heidi's going to get some coffee here in a few minutes. We're going to have a coffee interruption.
Welcome back, everyone. So here I'm going to try to cover a topic that I could talk about for days in about 45 minutes. But I'm very pleased to have here two colleagues that will also be part of the resource table, so I want them to have their chance also to talk. And then I have here, so JJ Lara is a colleague and a friend of mine, and he's a great presenter, so I feel too like he can do this with his eyes closed. So I'm going to defer to you two. If I miss anything, please feel free to interrupt, either one of you. So I'm just going to talk about some things about the LGBT community, and like I said, I'm going to do my best to cover this in the time that we have. Before I get into that, can everyone hear me in the back? Yes. So I wanted to go over a few agreements that are not there. I didn't write them down. But overall, I want to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves. So if anyone needs a break and you need to stand up or go out, please do so. If there is something that's said here that you disagree with, given values or beliefs of religious foundation or whatever the case may be, that we make this space a space where we're going to respectfully disagree or agree or whatever the case may be, but we're going to be kind to one another. Also, that this topic could have some implications for folks that may be in the room for personal reasons or other reasons, so that we remember that this is about social justice, and that's the reason why I'm talking about this today and why we feel like this is an important area that deserves attention, okay? So those are the agreements that I wanted to put out there. Also, to reflect for a moment on these thoughts about the future well-being of this nation is dependent on our ability to embrace diversity, our ability to build cross-cultural understanding. And I think we talked a little bit when we're talking about Latinos in general, about how it is pretty impossible that we can do this work in isolation and do it well. So we have to build this cross-cultural understanding, increase our knowledge, our ability to help each individual realize his or her own potential, and to build a more just, non-violent society that vigorously protects the rights of all. So now I'm going to pause here to say, when we say all, we're not talking about, in the context of violence, we're not talking about only white, heterosexual, US-born, young victim. We're talking about everyone. So that's something to keep in mind, and that's the focus that I would like to bring to this discussion. As I said earlier, this is more a dialogue, even though I have slides. So I invite everyone to participate. We come to this work from the perspective of, when we're talking about violence, we see this as a human rights issue. Because violence violates the rights, in this case of the victims of violence, to live a life free from that by creating fearful and unsafe environments around them for them and their families. We know that achieving or restoring their safety must be at the center of everything that we do. But we also know that we cannot restore this sense of safety unless we practice services, We provide approaches that are culturally relevant and that really resonate with that person. So we spent some time talking earlier about some of the things that could happen if we don't really understand this Latina cultural context that we were talking about before. So now, in this conversation, in a few moments, we're going to add a new dimension to the identity of this survivor. We're going to talk about sexual orientation as well in a moment. I mentioned earlier that among Casa Esperanza's principle is this idea of a strengths-based advocacy, that acknowledging survivors' strengths is where we start doing our work. Somebody was talking earlier, that those of you that played the role of the advocate, you were talking about, all of you wanted to ask Rosa what she wanted. And sometimes that's hard, right? Because maybe what Rosa wants is not what we think she needs. So then what do we do? What is our role? And I think Patricia said earlier, what our role isn't to say to Rosa, or that older survivor that I mentioned, that she needs to leave the relationship, right? And also the piece that I said earlier, I cannot stress enough the importance of community engagement in the work that we do. We have to know our community. We have to work with community. When we hear, oh, we don't work with gay victims because we never see them, they don't come to us. It's actually, I invite you to think about this the other way around. They don't come to you because you're not accessible to them. And the same with older adult survivors. I never see them. They don't come to us. Latinos don't come to us. I don't need interpreters. I only see one a year. What does that say about your services? So it's the other way around. So that's what I would like to invite you to think about. If you don't see gay people in your program, something is missing. Okay? So I wanted for a moment make a parenthesis here and talk a little bit about trauma. And this notion from Judy Herman, who is a trauma-informed advocate that talks about, she says trauma is contagious. Do you think that's accurate, her observation?
Yes.
I think many of us talk about secondary trauma. We talk about vicarious trauma, our exposure to that. Some of you see this day in and day out. You hear terrible stories, right? You meet people at their most difficult times. So what is trauma? So trauma is an extreme stress that overwhelms someone's ability to cope. The experience of a threat to their life, their body, or sanity, it is determined by the person who experiences the trauma. So it isn't for us to say, that was a traumatic experience. Maybe what is experienced, what is perceived to me as trauma might not be the same for that person. So who determines my life was at risk is that person. I felt this threat. You know, I may have some opinions about it. I could help her or him assess the risk, but the person defines, based on their experiences, whether this was a threat to their life. But it also, when we think of trauma, also see trauma as a normal response to an abnormal event. So not always see it as this bad thing. It could be a response, a normal response to a dramatic event or an abnormal event. Who can think of examples of things that could lead to trauma? Any examples? Family violence, yes. What else?
Being in battle.
Being
a soldier.
Yes, being a soldier. Yes, being a soldier. You're exposed to a lot there. Yes, definitely. And for that, for the soldiers, we hear of a common term that is also, we see that with other people that are not soldiers, but we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder in some cases, right? What else?
Death of a loved one.
The death of a loved one could be a traumatic event. What else? Natural disasters, yes. Natural disasters. So we heard a lot about Katrina, right, in New Orleans, and how devastating that was. Definitely. What else? A car accident. So that is something that could happen suddenly to someone. I know I have a friend who is a runner, and she got hit by a car. Nothing happened to her. It was a fast thing, but she used to run. She couldn't run for years after that. She was able to recover physically quickly. She didn't have any major injuries. But the impact of that event on her cost her many years of not being able to run. Someone was going to say something. Illness? Illness in general. If it's a long-term illness or a short-term, or a diagnosis, right? Could be a traumatic event. What else?
Victim of a crime like a theft or
Yes. Theft. Could be an assault on the street. How about witnessing traumatic event? That could also have tremendous impact. We talk about children's exposure to trauma. We heard the program earlier, the family violence program. Yes.
loss of financial security.
Yes. Loss of financial security. We heard a lot of examples of people that lost their homes and they lost everything, right? Because they lost their jobs and they lost their homes. Yes. Divorce could be very traumatic. How about other societal things? How about oppression, discrimination, homophobia, racism? And let's think about those that have lived with that, exposed to that over time. What's the impact of that? What could that be? We have examples here. We talked too about historical trauma. Anybody can talk a little bit about that in this group? What does that mean, historical trauma?
We have groups in our community. If you talk about Native Americans who lived through being moved onto the reservation or had to have their hair cut and change their clothes because they had to go to different types of schools, and that trauma that went through that. And then, I mean, we even had a person who was a victim of the Holocaust as one of our clients, and the trauma that caused on her. And so these are like things that happen in society, in the world, and that impact that carries with them forward.
Exactly. So the experience of the Native Americans in particular, being stripped of their identity, forced, a new culture, religion, everything else, right? So the notion, and the person that coined that term is Native American, and the notion is that this is passed on from generation to generation. Even if you yourself didn't live that experience, it's passed on to you. How about Latinos? Can we talk about historical trauma?
Yeah.
Anyone would like to share an example?
Yes.
Go ahead.
So, exiles from other countries, Somalians, even refugees, Haitians, individuals who are uprooted from their country and having to go to another country. And I'm a refugee myself, so I certainly know how that feels to be from another country and having to basically learn the culture and having to be allowed in society with a culture that's not your culture, but you're having to basically adjust, and then of course being discriminated against because of language, race, color.
So the experiences overall of refugees that have to leave their own countries and come to a new society, we talked about this acculturation continuum. And going through that process could be traumatic for some people if they don't have the resources to do that. So with that in mind, thinking about historical trauma, thinking about oppression and stigma, discrimination. With that in mind, let's continue to think about, again, all of these dimensions and layers that could define someone's identity when we go into speaking about Latino LGBT survivors in this case. What happens if we don't understand trauma? What could happen? What could be the results of that? So you could remind people of their traumatic experiences, even if you don't intend to do that. And we've talked a lot about intent versus results, or, it doesn't matter if your intent isn't to be homophobic, but if someone discloses to you that they are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, and you immediately move back, body language, you don't have to say much. What could that mean for someone? There could be an increase in symptoms. For some folks, could be use of substances or eating disorders or more isolation, withdrawal from relationships. So this is a question for the group. Are we trauma informed? And what does that mean? Because I think we've been talking about that lately a lot. Being trauma informed and we're trauma-informed, we want to be trauma-informed, and I think for some people, sometimes it is an abstract concept of, well, I'm not a psychologist, I guess that's not for me to achieve. What does that mean, being trauma-informed? What's your understanding of that concept?
Is that a term that's not synonymous but along the same lines as culturally sensitive?
Yeah. So Sylvia is saying that it's a term that's not synonymous, but it's along the same lines as of being culturally sensitive. We talk about being culturally specific, right? Knowing and understanding the context of people's lives when they come to you. What else? What other elements, so you understand that, what other elements do you think? Thank you. What other elements do you think are important in being trauma-informed? What other elements? So, we're sensitive. To be sensitive to one's culture, you need to understand that culture. I've heard people lately talking about cultural authenticity. So beyond sensitivity, they talk about authenticity. So you really breathe that and practice that. And if you're an ally, because that's not your culture, doesn't mean that you become now, more Latinos than Latinos because you're going through the trainings again. But I think the awareness to say, I don't know enough about your reality. Teach me about that. So a piece about that is humility. That's something that I think is extremely important. This is respect and humility and recognizing our own privilege as service providers. When you're working with a survivor, if you're wearing the hat of an advocate, for example, or law enforcement, or whatever the case may be, a social worker, you have tremendous privilege at that moment. You hold the keys to a lot of resources and opportunity. I think it's important to understand where our privilege lays and to be humble about that, So the LGBT community, the topic at hand at the moment. Okay, so I wanted to bring, and this is something that JJ over here does, and has inspired me to do that, and I'm in Texas, so I wanted to bring Gloria and Saldua to this space, and this is a quote, one of Gloria's quotes that I think is really important and really highlights some of these things. She's talking here about this concept, although she doesn't say that in there, but she's talking here about this concept of intersectionality. How we have to navigate all of these layers of our identities, and how difficult that is. So I wanted to bring her into this space. I don't know, JJ, if you want to add something? Putting her on the spot.
Well, can everyone hear me? Yeah. Hi, everybody. So I just think I've been doing victim services for 15 years, and now I work with a statewide organization. And in my 15 years of working with survivors, I have learned that I need to have a more holistic approach when dealing with survivors. And I think as those of us who identify as victim service professionals, working with victim services, we have done a great job of training ourselves in dealing with a person's identity as a victim of a crime. But quite often we forget to focus on the rest of the person's identity. Who are they? Are they a mom? Are they a dad? Are they grandparents? Are they single? Are they married? Are they, do they have a job? Are they professional? Are they bilingual? Are they multi-ethnic? And that becomes a barrier for a lot of us when we're providing services for certain identities in our community, whether we want to think of that or not. I think if you're part of this culture, the US culture, at some point you have all expressed some type of ism towards the person in front of you, whether it's intentional or unintentional, because of the other. We don't understand them, who they are. And in the case of intersecting identities of being a victim of intimate partner violence, being an elder person, and also perhaps identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, all of these issues come up for us. it challenges our perceptions of what is right and wrong, what is moral and immoral. And that is shown, that reflects, that comes out when you're doing services. It really does. And in my 15 years of working with survivors, my entire career has been focused in nonprofit. And when I started working as a legal advocate in Brownsville, in the Friendship of Women, how many know where Brownsville's at? Yay, that means that tells me you know where South Padre Island is at. Spring break, 91, yes. Anyway, yes, man, it was a good year. Anyway, I'm in church. God forgive me. Anyway, so where was I? Okay.
91.
Yes, 91. So working 15 years and working Friendship of Women as a legal advocate and looking, and I'm sad to say that I never saw a lesbian survivor in front of me. I saw a lot of women, Latina women, a lot of women who identified with the Mexican culture primarily, but I never saw someone who potentially was a lesbian survivor. And it got me to thinking, what am I giving off to people in front of me? But I think that's part of the challenge as service providers, as representatives of different institutions.
So the comment, the point about what am I doing that I'm in 15 years I haven't seen a lesbian survivor. So that's the point. It's what I was saying earlier, right? Like not doing the other analysis the other way around. Oh, they just don't come. Because I've been doing this work for 15 years and I just didn't see them. That's where we can go. And I think we often go there because sometimes it's the easiest thing to do. What does that mean that they don't come? So just quickly, let's do this quick exercise in the spirit of getting onto the same page. So if you could please take notes. I'm going to tell you, so you need to write what I'm going to tell you. And this is what we're going to follow. If you could just on a piece of paper on the back of the presentation, if you could write the name of a group that you belong to. A name of a group. It could be a political party, it could be a spiritual community, it could be how you identify, one of the dimensions of your identity. The name of a group that you belong to. So write a few things, 2 things or 3, that you love about that group. So are folks still having questions about the group idea? You're good? So any group, like I said, could be a political party, it could be a club, it could be a dimension of your identity. You know. So, and then you're gonna write 3 things or less that you love about that group. The next step, write the name of a group that you can guess does not like your group. Okay? You come up with a group that you guess doesn't like your group. And then if you could write down or even think of some of the stereotypes that you think this group says about your group. Okay? So imagine that this group that doesn't like your group has something that you need in order to get from one day to the next safely. So imagine that. What comes up for you? If you're thinking about, I need this group that doesn't like me, and they are the ones that have what I need to get to tomorrow safely. What comes up for you? Could be a word to words. So how are you feeling about meeting this group that doesn't like you? What comes up for you?
To try to find some common ground, something that you can be common with.
I'm sorry?
If you find a common ground with the other group or the other people, if you can find something that you agree on or that you have in common, it'd be easier to start there.
So you're saying this because this came up for you and you feel like sharing?
You know, just have to answer your question.
No, I'm just curious. Like, how did this come up? You think that if you find a common ground, that would make this easier?
Yes.
What comes up for people? Who else wants to share? What? Fear comes up for you when you think about needing something from someone that doesn't like you, your kind, doesn't like you. What else?
Defensive.
You're defensive.
Tolerance.
Tolerance. Explain that a little bit. What does that mean?
To respect in order to work together, to get from point A to point B.
So-
You have to have tolerance and respect.
So this is what kind of a little bit like what you were saying about finding common ground, the places where we agree. That's very interesting.
And even if we don't agree, we tolerate the point of view of the other group.
That's very interesting. Any other comments? Thank you for sharing, everyone. Any other comments?
Making nice in a protective way. I mean, that's a strategy, I guess, that comes up, that helping handle is that one way to prepare for meeting people that don't like me is to figure out how I can make nice and appear unthreatening.
So making nice. So you go there, you're going to be, very nice. You're going to try to put your fears aside. What does that take, though? This is a situation of life or death, What does that take from you? You're in a crisis situation. You need to do all this. How is that process?
Well, it's a faking it. It can be part of that is faking it.
It's faking. It's not real. And in terms of energy levels, you already have a crisis that you're dealing with, so you have to also deal with this other thing. They don't like you, so you have to appear, a certain way. You want to be liked, so you can get what you need because you don't have a choice here. This is life or death. Anything else? Any other comments?
Fear of rejection.
Yes. So you play nice because the ultimate fear is that you're going to be rejected because they don't like you. What happens to the power dynamics here? Are you on equal turf here? Is it even? So clearly there's someone who has the power because you need that, right? It's not like you have a number of options and, I'm going next door. You don't have many options. Someone clearly has the power. So let's think of those dynamics also. Let's remember that. What would it be like if you had to go to someone for help and you know that group doesn't like your kind for whatever the case may be, whatever reason? Yes.
I think you'd have a very high level of anxiety, and also I think you would tend to suppress things that you ordinarily would want to bring out, but if you thought it wouldn't be acceptable, you would suppress those, which would again further increase the anxiety.
So the anxiety level could be very high because you're kind of like performing in a way, right? You have to put on this persona that's not how you're feeling. So is that the demand is really high to do all this. You have to perform well, behave well because you don't want to be rejected, but you're in crisis. You need this for your safety. So tremendous anxiety. Thank you for pointing that out. So thank you all for sharing. I just wanted all to get to this point where we can, and maybe many of us probably experience some of that at some point. For some of us maybe it was more or less, but for a number of different reasons, right? I think we could probably relate to maybe not being liked by someone at some point. I'm bringing this to the extreme case of now this is a life or death situation. So why is it important to learn or to explore more, to discuss the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community? in this context, yes.
When you learn about something, you come to understand them better where they're coming from. And that way, you can serve them better. And you can understand kind of understand where they're coming from a little bit better.
So when you learn about someone better, when you learn about somebody, it's a little bit about the cultural context that we're talking about too, in a way. That if you learn about that community in particular, so you're better prepared to respond to those needs. People were talking about, again, cultural sensitivity or authenticity or awareness, right? That, understand the difference, or what are the commonalities, what are the differences. Why else is it important for all of you doing this kind of work?
Because you will never know when a member of the family is going to have a love.
So, because it could be that maybe there is a loved one too. So so what dimension does that bring? That brings a personal dimension to this too. It's not only at work, but also personally. So it could have that implication. Why else? You're doing this work. I'm assuming that the common theme here among all of you is to end violence, right? So we have people from adult protective services, from domestic violence and sexual assault advocates, victim advocates. Why is it important?
I think one of the reasons that it's really important is because the numbers aren't all that different. The numbers in gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender relationships and the numbers in heterosexual relationships when it comes to domestic violence, they really aren't that different.
So that means if you are not seeing survivors from the community, something is missing. We know the need is there. So I guess I also want to go to this piece about, were you going to say something?
Yeah, can you mention something you shared with me last night regarding the group that you spoke with in New Mexico, and they had 50 employees, and they said we don't. Can you talk about that?
So I spent some time with a group in New Mexico, and they're doing serious work through getting through homophobia, and they're looking at their policies. They're really spending a lot of time to change practices. But when we first met about it, it's about 50 plus employees. They told me that there is nobody gay in that organization. So that's exactly what I did. I laughed too. I was like, there are no gays in New Mexico. I was like, that's so interesting. Probably there are no gays in San Antonio either, you know?
Or in this room.
So, again, the point wasn't for anyone to out themselves, and that's not what this is about either today. But the reality is that in terms of statistics and all that, it is a very common part of the human experience, and sexuality is very fluid. And we can talk about this later and debate it as much as you want to. I'm not going to get into that either. But to assume that everyone is heterosexual in this room is a symptom of what? Heterosexual privilege. Those are the words of the privileged talking. You know, so therefore, oh, there are no gays here, you know, we never see them, you know, it's all related, right? And if we are about social justice and ending violence for all, again, we're not going back to the list, only the white, US-born, heterosexual, young victim, we're talking about all. So this is our responsibility. So this isn't because, you know, it's an extra job and we got a special grant to do this. Also to remind you that if you receive federal funds, you're required to provide services to everyone. If you receive federal funds, and especially for domestic violence programs that receive Family Violence Prevention and Services Act money, they're required to be accessible to people that are have limited English proficiency issues. So again, I forgot to add from my list, also English speaker, where I said US born, but also fluent English speaker from that list. So we have to do it, we have a responsibility, it's the ethical thing to do. And if we're about social justice and human rights, this is another reason to do this work. So words, do you think labels matter? Who feels brave enough to yell words that we use in our communities? I'm going to talk to the Latinas and Latinos in the room now. words and labels to talk about the LGBT community? Yeah, that's one of them. Actually, I learned that because we don't use that in Cuba. That's it, but I learned that. What else? What other terms? Oh, somebody said, yeah. What else?
Mi mamá me dejó en mariquitas, en un lado, se les hace agua a la canoa.
De las otras,
Are any of these positive attributes? So I think we agreed that labels do matter and they have tremendous impact on people, right? But we all easily could remember some of the words that are used, and we have them in English too, right? I don't have to get into that now. I just wanted to, for a moment, remember some of the things that we've heard. We grew up here. Some of us probably said the words too, right? Maybe we're still hearing those terms. Yeah. So I think we've said some of these, we've been saying lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. Do folks know what the rest of the letters mean? Q, I, H.
Q is queer.
Queer or questioning. I, intersex. Everybody knows what that means. Intersex. What was the term that was used before, especially by the medical community, to talk about intersex individuals? Well, first of all, what does that mean? Anyone would like to talk about that? Whoever said the term? Somebody's born with both sex, female and male. What was the word that was used? Hermaphrodite. We don't use that word anymore. Speaking of language, somebody was asking me about how language changes. That's a term that, again, within the social justice context, we have rejected the use of that term because of the implications that that word has. People that were born like that, were experimented on, went through a lot of suffering and pain, so we don't use that word anymore. We use intersex. Again, another example of language changing. The letter H is there for some communities, that they refer to communities living with HIV within the LGBT community. That sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. Any other examples you think that we should talk about from the letters that are used?
The A is not there.
No. Ally. A also sometimes appears for ally, that's true.
And sometimes you see two-spirit, 2S.
Yeah, two-spirit. Do you want to talk about that too, where that comes from?
That comes from the Native American tradition of believing that you can have both qualities of male and female. And in certain cultures in Native American tribes, it was actually considered to be a good thing. It was actually worshipped, and people were thought to have qualities of both male and female. So sometimes you'll find people who will refer to themselves as two-spirit.
Yeah. It's a beautiful term to think about it. So I'm just going to put a list here, and I think we've gone over some of them now. But I wanted to touch on the ones that we haven't discussed. So, for example, gender expression or gender identity, yes.
you were talking about language and isolation and everything, and an intersex person, there is no pronoun. There is no pronoun for that. And how isolated you would feel just from that, because there is no that describes that.
That's an interesting, very interesting concept too, because do you folks want to talk about that in terms of pronouns? And we'll get to that in a moment too, but.
I do training for SAPD for the cadets that are coming out. Sure. Yes, sorry. It's okay. I do the SAPD training for the cadets who are graduating out of class, and I do the LGBT training. And a big part of the training is pronouns. And usually what I tell my cadets is, it's really okay to ask,
what pronoun do you prefer? So everyone has a pronoun that they prefer. Hopefully, you have something. Well, you know, we can talk about pan and cisgender, which actually are those who are more fluid and just choose not to choose a gender. And you'll see that a lot with young people today, where if you guys are old enough to remember Saturday Night Live and Pat, you know, you never knew what Pat was, if Pat was male or female. Well, yeah, cisgender. So one of the things in looking at that is usually just ask. Just ask. Most people prefer you ask than you assume.
Thank you. And the list of terms here, and thank you for that, because the pronouns is something that you'll be dealing with, right, in your work, when someone comes to you. And we can, what are the implications, you know, for the day-to-day in terms of the pronouns? And here, although we're not going to get into details because we don't have enough time, but think about your intake forms. What do you have in your intake forms? Think about, are you excluding people based on the questions that you're asking? What options are you making available? Are you allowing people to self-identify? Is that how you're doing the work, or are you assuming that based on the way people look to you, they should be this or that? You have to think outside of the binary too. Sometimes that doesn't work. You have to think beyond that. But anyway, from the list of terms here, for example, could people talk about gender expression or identity? What does that mean? What comes to mind when you hear gender expression or gender identity?
How a person self-identifies?
Is the outer appearance, right? Is the expression, how you present yourself to the world, right? Let's see, what else from that list? Do we know what transphobia means? Transphobia? Fear of transgender, the transgender community. So something that we, again, cannot assign, we're not clear on, so that's scary. And we're going to talk about the transgender. It's an umbrella term that encompasses a lot of things. We're going to get into that in a moment. How about heteronormative or heteronormativity? What does that mean? So yes, in the media we see constantly, right? We're bombarded with images about family. So what do we see for family?
Father, mother.
Mother and father. Mother and father. We see there is anything, I mean, advertisements constantly, if there is a family, it's a heterosexual couple. That's heteronormativity, that everything that is presented, that's put out there, the assumption is that is a heterosexual, that prevails, that's the only thing we see.
And can I say, I think there's, especially among some of even my generation of friends, that there's a movement towards non-traditional marriage now too, where I have a lot of my friends that are in open relationships, where they are in a committed relationship with one partner, but they are very much open to having other partners. And so that works for them, and there is no judgment, but that there is a trend away from the marriage and going into those open relationships. And that is something that I think when we always have those boxes of married and single, but that's also something to take into consideration when we have these conversations.
So is that there is a lot of variation, right? So the norm, what is the norm? That there is tremendous variation. Sexual expression, identity, what marriage means. That doesn't mean that one is right or wrong, and I think that's where we have problems. It's when we attach our values, our beliefs to that. That's when it becomes problematic. I think that the other piece in all of this, even if we don't get through the whole presentation, is to realize that we don't have a choice here. We don't have a choice, we don't have time. We're thinking about somebody whose life is in danger, is at risk. So our own biases We don't have time for that. I think there's a sense of urgency in this conversation, in this context, given the work that all of you do, right? So this is a little chart that I like, I think is very useful, that explains this, gets into, is a gender-bred person, that gets into explaining, you know, gender expression and identity, and if you look at that, so sex is what we're born with, the biological, what we're born with. So that's why intersex is somebody who's born male and female, right? Our attraction, where the orientation comes from. The orientation is what our feelings towards someone else. That's from the heart. You can't tell what people's orientations are. That's why in New Mexico, everyone was heterosexual. Because you can't always tell. Now, sometimes they are very, given the identity or the gender expression, the manifestations of that on the outside, sometimes people are more open or more visible and more vocal about it. So sometimes people make assumptions because of what they see, but that's not always possible. So that was the timer to tell me that I'm out of time. So, I use this because I think it's useful to remind you of the difference between one thing and the other. You know, the expression is the manifestation, how you identify us and how you want the world to see you. But the attraction or the orientation is the feelings that you have. Is that's why it's by the heart. It's what you feel for someone. This part, this is sometimes the conversation I have with my mother every other week. Sexual attraction is not the same as gender identity. And I think this is very, very hard for some folks to understand. The fact that someone may want to or feels like they feel female on the outside and they want to look that way, that doesn't make them automatically being attracted to men. And that's very difficult, especially in the case of transgender folks. People that go through the process of surgery and everything else. So this is a born male who now is going through the process to become a female. Doesn't mean that she's doing that so that she can be with men now. That's not the reason. You could still be attracted to females. So I've heard the argument, so why going through the process? Because one thing has nothing to do with the other. This is about gender expression, the outside, and how I want to be perceived, and how I identify has nothing to do with what I feel here. The reason for having surgery or going through the process is not so that now I have permission to be with somebody of the opposite sex. And that's very difficult for people to grasp sometimes.
To put it in simpler terms, like in racial identity, I don't choose to be Latino, I am Latino. Although assimilation, acculturation may try to erase my identity for whatever reason, my skin, and some days I'm more ethnic looking than others, I am Latino. I don't choose to be Latino, I am Latino. And if you were to talk to my parents, you're Mexican. None of this Latino thing, you're Mexican. But I was born here, just be aware. So just to clarify, I was born here. So just to put it in those contexts, it's like, you know, if you have darker skin, you have darker skin. I don't choose, I mean, I am who I am. I was born Latino, I was born to a Mexican family. But systems, assimilation, acculturation impacts at all levels, whether it's age, sexual orientation, gender expression, racial identity. And in fact, you know, as a Latino person, every time I drive back home to Brownsville, y'all know there's a checkpoint in Sarita, right? Oh my God, the anxiety that I suffer on the way back to Austin, because I put on my Toby Keith and I put on my hipster clothes and I try to look as American, whatever that means. So these are the kind of things of intersectionality and identity I always have to negotiate every time I drive back home and come back. The same thing happens when I'm crossing through TSA. I'm being asked to pronounce my name. I may be pulled aside. I may all these things. So imagine if you are a trans person who is trying to negotiate their gender identity and expression in a society where forces you to assimilate, to be a certain way. Again, I kind of liken that process to this. I am Latino, I am brown, this is who I am. It's not a choice. And in fact, society reminds me of that consistently. Sorry.
You know, something else on that same note, it's not unusual to find a married couple who've been together for a very long time and have one partner transition and they remain together. So it will look like a lesbian couple, but they've been together for 30 years. One of the partners may have transitioned 15 years into the relationship. So they can stop loving their wife when they transition.
So that blows my mother's mind. So this is the umbrella term that I was talking about when we talk about transgender, and understand that there are all of these terms that we've heard probably about, we've heard before, here and there. So these are some of the things that could fall under, sorry, that doesn't, it's kind of like over there on the wall, but that, all of those are under that transgender umbrella. So you have cross-dresser, drag queen or king, depending. Gender non-conforming, and these are the folks that, as you were saying before, don't choose to identify with either one in particular. Again, going beyond the binary. Androgynous, what does that mean? Anybody knows what that means?
Headache.
Headache. Because you can't put it in a box, right? You can't tell. So somebody that has both characteristics and is very difficult to box somewhere. Intersex, we talked about already. And then transsexual, pre-op, non-op or post-op. And about this, never ask somebody if they had surgery. That's a very, very personal thing. I think sometimes people out of knowledge, due to lack of knowledge and trying to be sometimes supportive, that's something that you don't ask somebody that's transitioning. And it's irrelevant, again, in the context of the work that you're doing, to know whether the person had surgery or didn't have surgery or whatever the case may be. What's important is to honor how they identify and understand that. So what are some of the ways in which this oppression manifests in an LGBT community? We've been talking about homophobia, right? It's the fear of the community. Misogyny. Do we know what that means? Yes, hatred of women. So the reason why I have this here is because, JJ was talking about his, the way he looks. Like, he's Latino, all the stuff that he does to get through the checkpoint and still, So let's think now for a moment about, let's say, a Latina lesbian who is a survivor of violence. All of the layers of oppression, and misogyny is one of them. So I think that's why the situations that you may see are compounded by many things here. We also talked a little bit about, we haven't talked about internalized homophobia. What does that mean? Yes? Internalized homophobia? What would that look like? So is this idea that something's wrong with me if I'm lesbian or transgender or because I'm going away from the norm? I'm breaking that. So even if I'm breaking that, there's a piece of me that feels something is wrong. I probably disappointed somebody. Remember that prejudice plus power equals oppression. And that's the piece that I think we have to really think about every day in our work. Remember the power and the privilege that you have and your own biases. That's why it's so important, and that's why I think and I challenge anyone that would tell me that work is work and my personal life is my personal life and they don't mix, and it doesn't matter what I believe because I'm at work now. I challenge you that that's not possible. If you're homophobic, if you're not in touch with that, that's gonna come across. Even if you're saying and you swear to me that you are doing your job and you're a good advocate, I challenge you that you cannot deliver services in the same manner as someone who is in touch with their privilege, who acknowledges when they are stuck. It would be better to say, I'm not the best person to work with this individual, because I truly believe that it gets in your way of being an effective advocate, somebody who's doing adult protective services work, in law enforcement, whatever the case may be. So what happens if you're Latino and identify yourself as part of the community? What are some of the things that could come up? And I think we talked about this earlier today, the tremendous importance of family. The importance that family plays in Latinos' lives. So if this is a family that isn't supportive of that, what kind of impact could that have? Again, when we're thinking about someone who is experiencing violence, it's not only about reporting the violence, because if you do, it's going to come out that you have a partner you're in a same-sex relationship. So the implications of that are at the society level, but also in the family, if you don't have a family that's supportive. We talked a lot about the interconnection, the interrelation. This is a key piece that the family plays. Do not underestimate the power of family in Latino communities. Do not. That plays tremendous, tremendous role in the decision to stay or leave a relationship. Okay. Also, gender role expectations. I think this is the other piece, and we can generalize this to other cultures too, because it's so tied to families. There is this expectation that if it's a girl, she's going to grow up to marry a guy and they're going to have babies, and vice versa. When that doesn't go that way, the implications that has could be tremendous. Briefly, we talked about culture and religion. For some people, again, the importance of religion and spirituality in Latino families, Latinos in general. So homosexuality is a sin. So are you gonna walk away from your community? Some communities are not accepting of this, others have. But it could be very, very difficult. And there is a handout that you probably have that you can look at later. The realities and internalized oppression faced by lesbians of color that I invite you to look at. It's again looking at this intersectionality, all of these elements that play a role in someone's identity. And this is a slide that a friend of mine developed that is the story of the Latina that I was telling you about. A Latina lesbian who is experiencing violence. These are all of the layers of challenges that she would experience as a woman, as a Latina, as a lesbian. And then what happens to the services, to the society, to the systems of support? What happens to her, given all of those layers that she brings? You have this in your packets, but so again, JJ was talking about holistic services, looking at the whole person. That's absolutely critical, and looking at the person and understanding their context, knowing and understanding their place in society, and not forgetting that there are all of these things. When they come to you, they bring all of this. So what happens? We talked about what happens when we ignore trauma. Before, we talked about that, right? So there is no one to talk to. If a transgender survivor comes to you and you start, oh, hi, sir. Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. And you do this 3 or 4 times in the conversation, chances are that person is not going to come back to you. Even if it's not your intention, if you're trying to do your best. That's why I was saying before that it doesn't matter at the end of the day if your intentions really weren't to harm someone, but you come across that way, that could be the last time you see that person. So there's no one to talk to. The person learns to hide. And these are coping mechanisms, but think about those and what they would do to someone. Those are just examples, really few. The person learns self-hate. We see, again, a lot about this with younger transgender folks. So I had a short clip, but I think that we have to...
Yeah, let's go to the panel, and then we'll see if we have time for that.
Yeah, okay. So the panel.
A couple of really
good points were brought up that I feel a need to maybe kind of readdress. Some things I think which are really important is how things are documented. So when we talk about using the wrong pronoun, I've had to go in and have records suppressed because in front of me is a person with hair on his face and hair on his arms, but his ID may say Michelle, and the worker will say he, and this person now has been outed and also put in an uncomfortable situation. So I've had to, it's really kind of crucial to remember that just those little things, when you're documenting, can make a difference. A huge thing that I stress with the cadets is, if you think it's domestic violence, ask the right questions. So there is a different, the power and control wheel still exists, but it becomes a little more complicated because how I can hurt you is I can tell your family that you're gay. Or if I'm the person who is controlling the finances, you can't go anywhere. Or if we have children and your husband or ex-husband doesn't know about our relationship, I can use that to get the kids taken away from you. So there are a lot of reasons why in a city the size of San Antonio that services by the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender population are not used in domestic violence. And a lot of it's not because it doesn't exist, because it does. It's just there are all these nuances that if this person tells my job, you know, I'm barely covered. I'm barely covered. And people will look at me differently. And when we see it, especially with the elderly, there has been a lot of times when, because the family has disowned them, the person that they're living with is the only person that can take care of them. So they give up that safety of that person who may control their medicine, that may control their ability to eat. So it complicates life so much, and it is such a population that is in need to know that there are safe spaces. That there are safe spaces. Where it gets really complicated is in the sheltering situation. I have placed lesbians in a shelter for domestic violence, and I have to be very clear to shelter staff that this is a same-sex relationship. Because who are we keeping out? Most of the time we're keeping out men. So the partner, who is a woman, can possibly get access, where under normal situations this wouldn't happen. So it's really important to be really clear at what you're looking at, because that helps to navigate the system. We have a great SAPD system that is really sensitive to same-sex domestic violence. I mean, they know how to document it, and we have a police chief who's very proactive when it comes to that. Mm-hmm.
You remind me of something. Sometimes it gets even more complicated when it's difficult to determine who the victim is and who is the perpetrator. So just happened yesterday, if you go to our website, there's going to be a recording of a webinar presented by the Northwest Network of Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Survivors of Abuse. They have developed a tool to help providers determine this, because sometimes it's not possible to tell. So what we've heard from programs is, oh, we can't, so maybe have this, and many of them have the policies of, we serve whoever comes first, could be the perpetrator. So how do you do that? I encourage everyone, please reach out to us. We could share with you more information too, because again, it can get complicated. And also, a point that they make at the Northwest Network, you mentioned the power and control wheel. The wheel is designed to highlight tactics of abuse. So whatever is on the wheel, the presumption is that that's what the abuser does. There are many instances that survivors use the same tactics, and they help people think through that. When would a victim, let's say, hide their partner's keys? Why would she or he do that? Well, maybe because it keeps him from going somewhere and getting drunk, or whatever the case may be. So it really invites people to not make assumptions, to walk away from these traditional tools, and to really gives a lot of information about thinking intent, who has the power in the situation, and who feels remorse for what happened. So those are the things that usually help you determine. Sorry, that reminds me.
No, but that is really good, because when we talk to the police department, one of the things we talk about is you walk in the room and you'll see this small guy and this big bruisey guy, and you're thinking, okay, let me go get him, and it's the small guy that just beat the hell out of the big bruisey guy. So there really is no way of telling. You can't decide, who's the aggressor, who's not. You really have to sit down and have the conversation, and it's not unusual for there to be children in the house. So that's another thing that we really need to take into consideration. Just because it's a gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender family does not mean that there are not children in the household.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jose Juan Lara, but I go by JJ. And I work with the Texas Advocacy Project, and we're a statewide legal nonprofit out of Austin, and we provide legal services for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and dating violence. But as part of our services, I really want to talk about systemic advocacy. The Texas Advocacy Project was formerly known as Women's Advocacy Project, and some of you may be more familiar with us with that name. And we've been around for about 30 years. But there was a change in our name because we understood that family violence, although primarily it is women who are making outcries as victims of these particular crimes, we also had an understanding that family violence, intimate partner violence, dating violence, stalking, and sexual assault happens in all kinds of relationships. And as part of that, we changed our name, and we also created the LGBT initiative, which is primarily a training and outreach component of our services. My role in the organization is as the Director of Advocacy and Training. And as part of the LGBT initiative, we actually go and do trainings, either one-day seminars or one subject topics in different parts of the state on this particular issue, which we'll be doing one here in San Antonio in a couple of weeks, which is being graciously hosted by Patricia Castillo and the Peace Initiative. Thank you, Patricia. And so from a systemic approach, we understand that family violence is a dynamic that impacts all kinds of relationships. And so I think as a victim advocate, doing this work for 15 years, I really, really want to put the onus on service professionals. It's on us. Quite often we do a lot of training. I've gone to conferences where we do workshops and presentations on what the victim should be doing and the responsibility that they have. And I understand, I've been working with lawyers and prosecutors and law enforcement probation for 15 years, and I understand that as a victim of crime, you need to initiate the system. But but as service providers, as representatives of institutions, how do we make that accessibility easier for victims of crime? And I think sometimes as in our various systems and our various institutions, we make it more difficult. And as part of the LGBT initiative, I have a lot of colleagues out in the state that call me and say, JJ, I have this trans survivor, I don't know what to do with them, and can you help me? And the first thing I'll ask is, what county are you calling from? What city are you calling from? And when they tell me, they identify where they're calling from, I said, no, you don't want to send them to the Family Violence Center there. You don't. Because unless I know there's an advocate there that I can refer directly to that advocate, this trans survivor of either sexual assault or domestic violence or dating violence or stalking, I will not send that person there. Because I cannot take the luxury of sending this person and being disrespected because that advocate doesn't empathize, doesn't understand, or is not willing to understand or empathize. Because their own internalized oppression or isms are coming about. And so it's really from a systemic approach that I start now to see these things. And it's a very difficult thing because when people, we've said this throughout the day, is that, well, why don't they come to us? It's like, well, why don't we go to the community? And a lot of it has to do with how we present our organizations to those communities. We did a training, we did an LGBT initiative training in Denton, of all places, with being co-sponsored by the local family violence center there. And we've been having conversations about how to coordinate, where to have it. And internally in their organization, they were discussing whether they would put their name of the organization as a co-sponsor on the registration flyer, because they were afraid of the repercussions in their community regarding around funding, support, what would the board members say. And we also have to understand that from a systemic approach, Texas is huge, and most community-based organizations are supported by who? Faith-based institutions in Texas. And I'm just talking about Texas. And that's a problem. And so with Denton Friends of the Family, they were having 6 months conversation, and should we put our name? They had a conversation with their management team. They had a conversation with their board members. I mean, it went all the way up. And this is just a simple training that we're just gonna have in Denton, Texas. But it took that kind of critical analysis and conversation because they were afraid of what would be the consequences in their community to their organization and how it would impact them providing direct services to the rest of the survivors in their community. So a month out before the training happened, they decided they're gonna put their name on the flyer, not a big deal. And we had the training, we had about 50 people show up from a cross-section of the community. And 2 months later, I get a call from the advocate there, and she tells me, JJ, we actually put inclusive language in our mission statement. And our mission statement says now, we will serve all victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, regardless of their race, political affiliation, religious views, sexual identity, gender expression. That's huge. That is very huge. So that's systemic change. And so, and I think for a lot of us who work for institutions, it's like, yes, you're telling us how to help, but how to do it. And I think that's great, but we really, I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a moment. We really have to have a critical analysis when we're considering to adopt or to open our services to all members of the community. You do have to build the infrastructure first. You have to look at how you train your personnel, and that comes from board members to executive director, to finance people, to direct service people, even to the community that you're serving. There has to be a training from top down. And even your volunteers. If you're going to be committed to serving all people and really having a social justice perspective on this issue, you need to train everybody that comes to your organization, even your volunteers. I was in Dallas a couple of months ago, again doing the similar training, and after we went to break, and one of the attendees asked me, JJ, I don't know if you can help me, but I'm in charge of training the volunteers that come to our shelter or are going to help our center. And we do the whole thing. We talk about the intersections of substance abuse and victims. We talk about child abuse and all these kind of marginalization issues. But when it comes to LGBT issues, I kind of make it optional for the volunteers to opt out of the training because I feel it's too challenging for some of our volunteers. And I said, that's your problem. If you're going to be training members of the community, why are they, if you're just making them choose to opt out of this part of the conversation and not the rest, that's a concern to me. Because the reality is that a lot of people that we help have a lot of social issues, right? And so we had conversations around that. And so it's really about systemically really, training your staff. And in the interview process, you talk about your mission statements. And right now here I'm talking to the community-based family violence organizations that are in the room right now. you really need to talk about your mission statement. And you need to be upfront with your staff. And if they can't hang with that, then you don't belong in this organization. Because if they have problems with a survivor who may identify as lesbian, gay, bi, or transgender, are they going to be able to deal with a survivor that may have substance abuse problems, may have some kind of reputation? I can guarantee you they will. So really, as agencies and even as system-based organizations, we have to be mindful of that structure. We need to build the infrastructure, and we need to have difficult conversations with incoming staff, current staff, volunteers, board members, because it really does impact how we provide that service. So when my colleagues in the family violence movement say, "Oh, we help all kinds of victims. As long as you're a victim of this crime, we're going to help you," I said, don't sit there and tell that lie. Because if that were true, then I wouldn't be getting calls around Latina survivors who can't speak English and are being refused services at shelters because the staff can't communicate with the survivor. And the one thing about living in San Antonio or coming from a border town is that we have the luxury of bilingualism, the privilege. It's amazing. But there are some communities out there in the great country of Texas that the staff, that the leadership of that organization does not represent the community that they're serving. The other question is your staff, your leadership circle, representative of the community you're serving actually? So Heidi kind of mentioned this earlier around the sole Spanish-speaking Latina advocate on staff, and that poor advocate that had been on call for 3 years, 24/7. Why aren't people coming to us? Well, is your management diverse enough? Is your board membership diverse enough? Is on your board someone representative from the aging community? From the young community, or even your staff? So these are the kind of questions we need to ask ourselves from a systemic approach. Who are we hiring, and how are we representing ourselves to the community? And it's not an easy answer. It's just things to consider. Because again, if for my colleagues who work in family violence and work with survivors of family violence, when we say, "Oh, as long as you identify as a victim of domestic violence, we're going to help you," that's not true. Let's be honest. Let's be honest about that. Because if that were true, then I wouldn't be getting the calls around a client who is monolingual Spanish speaker can't get to shelter because the staff there can't speak the client. And my organization went through the same process. When I came on board 5 years ago, as a director of advocacy and training, I asked the then legal director and the then management, I said, "Well, why don't we have bilingual attorneys that speak Spanish?" And what they told me was, "Well, we can't find qualified attorneys that speak Spanish." Ooh, okay. You were able to find me. I'm not an attorney, I'm a professional. I'm bilingual. I said, okay, I let it go. But I I held on to the conversation. 5 years later, we have 6 Spanish-speaking staff. 2 of them are screeners, which are very important. We have 3 Spanish-speaking attorneys, one of them being the legal director now, hallelujah. But from 5 years ago now to having almost 6 staff that are bilingual in Spanish, and I pushed it little by little, and that's the kind of question to ask. And now we have 6 bilingual Spanish-speaking staff. So these are the kind of challenges I think internally we need to own up ourselves as systems providers, as systems representatives. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, we're going to take a break here in a few minutes for lunch, but I My part of this is to bring in the elder component, and we're going to try to maybe make that happen. We did the Latina, but I'm going to try to talk about the older LGBT community. But I want to make some important points. A lot of what you're hearing today relates to the older person. What makes it different is the fact that whatever level of functioning that person may have, and outreach to those individuals, accessibility of services. And when you say you don't really have the numbers to justify training or hiring a specific staff, it's because you're not providing the outreach that's specific to the older population that's out there that needs services. And outreach is not an old person on the front of a brochure standing next to the son or daughter with information on the inside. And I think that you have to get to this point where we have to challenge ourselves with the older population and say, where can we go to provide information to this population to find out what it is we need? The other thing you ask yourself is to calculate the number of informal and formal hours of training in the field of gerontology, of aging, that your program has together as a group, and decide whether you have the qualifications. I see a lot of heads shaking. Just because they're an adult doesn't mean you treat them like all the other adults. Do you understand what I'm saying? Just because they're over 18, everybody from 18 to 105 doesn't get treated the same way. Just because you have grab bars and in your facility doesn't mean you provide services to people with disabilities. Does it not? The same thing is true with seniors. And when you start talking about older LGBT community, the QIs, a lot of things I learned today. Thank you very much for me. But the other thing is, when you start talking about that community, you're talking about a life course perspective of oppression for a group that has internalized homophobia just themselves, for growing up in a time when this kind of lifestyle was unacceptable and continues to be, and in their mind continues to be. Continues to be. Families who have probably isolated them, who have rejected them, they've rejected themselves, they've hidden this to their families and friends and everyone they've known in their whole life. I mean, you know, we had those BS, it's like, okay, seriously, she's been living with this one for like 25 years, and she's the roommate still. I mean, everybody in the family knows, but nobody says anything. And now they're in their 70s, and one is in the hospital, and the partner can't go in there to see her because they've never made the proper arrangements for them to be able to see one another. And I've had colleagues and friends that have been faced with things where the family came in and said, I know you lived here in this house with her for 50 and 60, 40 years, and I know she's dead now, but her stuff belongs to her family, not to you. You're not her family. And that's not to say the point that Naomi made, that the numbers regarding domestic violence in the LGBT older community as well. I guarantee you, we talk to APS I see y'all everywhere. We talk to APS, I guarantee the LGBT community is represented there. And the older population, the disabled population, we cannot, I mean, so many things have been said here today. Everything that's been said here should be transitioned into thinking about older adults. Because we're not specifically putting pictures or thinking about them up there, you have to transfer the information you've heard from everyone that's been up here today speaking, and think about that. And to start putting yourself out there some more, providing more training. Training is the key, but here's the thing I think. You know, I tell my students, as a professor of gerontology, I tell my students this all the time. Okay, so you think old people are great and they're cute and you've always wanted to work with them and you have a passion for them. But the truth is, how do you feel about aging yourself? That's another ism you have to consider. People spend millions of dollars to look like Joan Rivers eventually. That's what they're going to look like when it's all said and done. Right? They can't even smile anymore. They can't eat out of a straw, drink out of a straw. Spend a lot of money to look like a pretty dead corpse. They look, oh, doesn't she look pretty? She's still going to die. We all, if you want to talk about commonality, you know what we have in common? We have two things. We're all getting older and we're all going to die. There's nothing you can do about that. Absolutely nothing you can do about that to change that. But you have to start asking yourself and be very honest. How do I feel about everything that's been talked about today? How do I really feel about it? And if you can't figure it out, if you can't keep your personal stuff in without, having to impose that on someone else, then you need to go into another business. I'll write you a letter recommendation. All right, let's have lunch. We'll see y'all in 45 minutes.